subscribe.
Popcorn therapy. Holistic health and wellness through the lens of pop culture. All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Popcorn Therapy, where we look at pop culture as therapy or look at therapy through pop culture. And today we're doing something just a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about a book. I usually talk about movies and TV on here. The books are obviously part of our pop culture. This is a nonfiction book, so it goes into a little bit more serious themes than we sometimes do here on this podcast. I'm also going to be really putting on my therapist hat for this one. And that being said, of course, everything we talk about here is for entertainment and education. And it's a good idea if some of these issues resonate with you to see a qualified therapist to talk about it. You could even see me if you want to. So we're going to be talking today about What My Bones Know by Stephanie Foo. So Stephanie Foo, you might know her if you ever listened to the podcast This American Life. She was a producer on that show for a long time and had some fantastic stories that I remember. She's a great storyteller. She has a great voice. And I have this book in print, but I listened to it as an audiobook. And she's just got a great cadence. She's got a great voice. She's very funny. This book is about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is actually now sometimes called complex post-traumatic stress response. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But it's basically her journey of sort of realizing that she was diagnosed with complex CPTSD and her experiences trying to heal from this. So as a therapist who works with trauma a lot, I'm a very trauma-focused, trauma-oriented therapist. This book fascinated me. And I love it because it's really spoken from her perspective. So I have a book about healing from my own trauma. It's a book called Want, and it's about coming back to sexual desire and sexual health after having been sexually assaulted. And I remember when I was doing the research for that book, I found, most books on trauma are written by clinicians and they're full of case studies. And there's this distance that you're looking at them from. I also find a lot of the time those books would be filled with really awful stories that, if you're a traumatized person, you'd be listening to those stories and just getting triggered or like getting dysregulated, and you can't even listen to what the lessons are or read them in these books. And so part of my intention with writing my book was to have a bit more of an accessible look into what trauma feels like from an individual's perspective. So that book is full of stories from my perspective. And this is exactly what Stephanie Foo is doing. I would say probably a lot better than I did it in my book. Although, please go ahead and check out Want if you want to. It's an interesting book. It's very intimate. And her book is that as well. It's very intimate. And I resonated with it as a therapist and absolutely as a person who's gone through some trauma recovery as well. I think it's a fantastic book. And if you want to learn about trauma, and especially if you want to learn about CPTSD or CPTSR, please do definitely check it out. Okay, so what is CPTSD? You may never have heard that word before. CPTSD is the framing that Stephanie Foo uses in this book, and that is the name for essentially developmental trauma that came initially through Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, which was new on the scene of trauma. And it offered a really different perspective on trauma that people hadn't thought of before. And what she was really focusing on is, trauma isn't necessarily a single event, but we often think of it as like, oh, this one bad thing happened that we have to recover from. CPTSD or CPTSR is more like many events happening over a long period of time, especially in childhood. So CPTSD as it was called, speaks to developmental trauma. So there are certain trauma healing modalities that are super useful now. Specifically, EMDR is one that a lot of people use and love. And EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is actually not always used for eye movement. It's sort of evolved beyond that to a degree. It can be really effective for reprocessing a single traumatic event, and people find it very useful in that case. But when it's a lot of experiences, when the trauma is something that didn't happen, like neglect in childhood, EMDR is not going to be so effective for working on that. We need different kinds of tools. Judith Herman wrote her book in 1997, and it kind of brought in this idea of looking at trauma in a little bit of a different way. Trauma work has an interesting history. It started as shell shock. It started as looking at how soldiers who were coming back from World War I were coming back different, and people were trying to understand what that meant. From there, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that became something that was recognized and understood, and it's evolved from there. So complex PTSD, again, is this developmental trauma, many things over a long period of time, creating a general dysregulation in the system. And the reason I'm sometimes using CPTSR for that is that recently people have started to say, okay, post-traumatic stress disorder implies that there's something disordered about the way that you're responding to that trauma. But what actually happens with trauma is that it's generally a healthy response to an unhealthy situation, a healthy, useful response to an unusual, wrong situation. We have all of our trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop. And these are all intended to be useful in stressful situations to help us survive. When something so outside of the norm happens that our bodies kind of can't regulate from it, or it doesn't feel like we've completed that trauma response, like the fight or flight, for example, wasn't able to happen, we weren't able to run away or fight off the predator, or if it feels like there's some change in the self or the worldview that creates a sense that the trauma is never ending, then it stays in our bodies as a dysregulated state, which again is our bodies trying to respond to something that really shouldn't have happened. So saying post-traumatic stress response takes some of the stigma out the experience of having trauma in your body. So the other thing I want to say about this, and I'm very much in therapist mode at this point, so you're getting a little bit of a lecture about this. I hope that you're still with me here. My favorite definition of trauma is any unhealed wound. So, for me, in my experience of trauma, what happened to me wasn't a big, violent, crazy plane crash or something like that. It was relational trauma. It was, I'm not going to tell you too much about it, but it was a betrayal, sort of sexual assault situation. And it created dysregulation in me that, as I went through my healing and learned more about it, it tapped into a lot of other things that I had been through in the past. So it compounded other things that I'd experienced that I wouldn't necessarily name as trauma, but that kind of built up to create a difficulty in feeling like I could respond around sexuality, like I could trust people, like I could trust myself. It created all of these other issues within me that needed healing in this more global sense, rather than just looking at this one event and healing from this single event. So when we do try to approach trauma from the EMDR perspective, which is like, oh, a bad thing happened, let's reprocess that memory and then you'll be cured, which yes, sometimes works. And that's amazing if it does. And I think we live in a society that is so unhealthy, so dysregulated. There's so many wrong things that happen all the time that many of us are living at that low-level trauma response place. It's just the sort of long term of living in a world where your emotions aren't understood, you're never heard, you don't feel like you can express emotions. You felt powerless in work situations, or based on gender reasons, or based on who you are, you feel like you can't be authentic. Like all of these things are kind of little, death by 1,000 paper cuts kind of a situation. So when that's quite big and it creates a lot of symptoms in our lives, it's called CPTSR, complex post-traumatic stress response. So let's get back to What My Bones Know, which is this beautiful memoir from Stephanie Foo. One of the things I love about it is that, she's diagnosed with CPTSD, is what she calls it in the book. And she kind of goes on this journey of like, okay, so I'm diagnosed with this now, like, what do I do? And there's a lot of shrugging of shoulders with her therapist, her medical team, anywhere she tries to go to find some help with CPTSD. It's sort of people saying like, oh, well, regular PTSR can be healed, but CPTSR is just like way beyond anyone's realm. There are a lot of therapists that would refuse someone with that diagnosis because they're quote unquote, too hard to work with. So CPTSR kind of fits into the hysteria history of medical disorders, which is basically this idea of like something's wrong with you and we don't understand it. So we can't really help you. It sort of fits outside of the rationality of what we've understood at this point. So we send you away, wish you luck, sort of thing. There's stigma that people with CPTSR have had to deal with from a therapy perspective, and they don't necessarily get the help they need. So, Stephanie goes on this journey of like, okay, do I try psychedelics? Do I try yoga? Do I try EMDR? Do I try, this countless list of different therapeutic approaches to see what can help me? And it's really relatable, I think, to listen to these stories of her going through these different experiences of trying to heal her trauma. Some of them work a little bit, some of them don't work so much. EMDR, she has one really great experience with it, and then she kind of can't get back to that place. Psychedelics actually do help her a fair amount. She uses psilocybin at certain points, and it does help to lift her mood, but it's sort of not long lasting. Like, it doesn't get to the root of the issue. It's very interesting to me to hear about her experience with yoga, because I've been a yoga teacher for many years, and yoga has certainly been, for me, a massive aspect of my healing from trauma and other things as well. And I've also had bad experiences with yoga in terms of that. So she starts doing, I think it's restorative yoga, and she's able to have this really relaxed experience in restorative yoga, and it does start to help regulate her nervous system. As a former restorative yoga teacher and practitioner, yes, absolutely. Restorative yoga is intended to do that, to help you to calm your nervous system. And for me, I was so dysregulated when I started doing restorative yoga, I just could not sit still. It's a practice where you lay down and you have like all kinds of bolsters and pillows and stuff, and you're supposed to get really comfortable. And you might stay there for 10 to 20 minutes. And people who have a regulated nervous system, I find, love this, and they can really rest, and some of them fall asleep. But for me, my anxiety was so high that I remember this one day where I thought I was allergic to the wool blanket because I got really itchy, but it was stress hives because I just couldn't sit still. It was so stressful for me to just lie there and like feel my feelings. Oh my gosh. So I don't know why, it worked quite well for Stephanie, but again, it sort of came and went. It wasn't always helpful depending on what she was going through. Sometimes it didn't work in that way. I remember really well this one moment where I was taking a yoga class. It wasn't restorative. It was a flow class or something with this really famous teacher. And at the end, we were in Shavasana, and she was doing this kind of manifestation conversation. She was saying, you manifested everything that's ever happened to you. Yes, you are that powerful. And it was supposed to be this kind of empowering message that you create your reality. But for me, I had been working so hard in therapy to convince myself that my sexual assault wasn't my fault. And then here's this teacher coming in and saying, you created that, you manifested that reality. And it's like, that's the very thing I had been trying so hard to get out of. And I went to the bathroom and didn't come out, and just held my sobs back, until I could get out of that class, and didn't really want to go back. So, you get some mumbo jumbo sometimes in these healing environments that can actually make it worse, right? So I appreciate that Stephanie talks about that. I also really appreciate how many therapists she tries. So you may or may not know about me that I am a counseling therapist, and I have a little bit of an alternative approach, partly because I came through yoga and meditation. So I sort of came from a different perspective than many people who go through, they're in school, they do this master's, they go this very sort of academic direct route. And I moved more from looking at how the body holds emotions, watching how that was happening for my students, starting to work with this kind of mindfulness mentorship, and that evolving into studying counseling and becoming a counselor. And so it's interesting because I have a lot of people come to me because they like that I'm not as a standard therapist, because they've had so many experiences of trying to go to therapy and have somebody say, I can't help you, you're crazy, or, they probably wouldn't say you're crazy, though I've been shocked by some of the things that my clients have told me therapists have said to them before. But, with that diagnosis, I can't help you, things like that. I've heard stories of therapists who, are really trying to convince somebody that they can trust them, that that's a relationship that they're in for the long term, and then essentially ghosted them and had their assistant let them know that they weren't working with them anymore, which to me is just maybe that was the protocol, but that's just so dehumanizing. And one of the things that I've noticed with my clients who have CPTSR is that the thing that they need is to be treated like human beings. That's often what it comes down to. And that's often where the trauma started, was that as children, they weren't treated as human beings at some point in some way. And then that was compounded on other experiences that they had where they were dehumanized. And there's a lot of power in being in a therapeutic relationship that's just authentic, even without this conversation of like, this technique works, that technique works. For me, it's not so much about technique, though there are techniques that can help for sure. It's more about having that genuine relationship that's not so bogged down by protocols, but actually informed by human connection. And that's something that towards the end of the book, Stephanie finds a therapist who, I actually can't remember the name of the style that he uses, but the way she describes it is that they talk about their relationship. They're very immediately in relationship with each other. Like, oh, the therapist might say, oh, I feel like that was a weird thing that I said just there. And I noticed that your mouth tightened when I said that. So like, what do you think about that moment between us? And they would really kind of break down like what's happening between them relationally. And I think that's really interesting because, for me, trauma is trauma because it's relational. So there have been these studies that have shown, in the plane crash example, you can have, let's say 20 people in a plane crash. 10 of them will be traumatized, 10 of them won't. And it's not the event that causes the trauma. It's how our systems receive and respond to the event. And this can speak to core beliefs we have about ourselves, core beliefs we have about the way the world is. So for example, if someone goes on a plane and they are in a state of trust with the world and the universe, and it just kind of rocks them, that may be traumatizing because they have to kind of figure out a new way of understanding the world. If someone goes on a plane and they're just like, oh yeah, bad things can happen, but I know that I'm not being punished and I'm sort of prepared for that. Or maybe, like I have a belief that when bad things happen, I can learn things from them and whatever it is. So I'm not saying that any of these worldviews is particularly better or worse, but if the plane crash interrupts the worldview that we sort of operate on, that's going to tend to become traumatic. So much of the time, the trauma, it's not the plane crash, it's that the rescue people didn't come. It's that the people that were supposed to help you get off the plane didn't help you. It's that, the way that people kind of panicked and like pushed people aside so that they could be saved or whatever it was. It's like, it's the moments where we feel like we should be supported and cared for. When that doesn't happen, that's often a place that trauma can start to grow. That's the seed of the trauma right there. So I think the other thing that I appreciated about Stephanie's book is that, her healing comes not from a magic pill, not from, though at the end she does have a style of therapy that she likes, you get the sense that it's a combination of all of these different things and all of this work that she's done to heal herself that allows her to come to a place that is functional, that is hopeful, that allows her to continue to heal from her experiences and learn and grow and all those things. It's not that there was one single piece that sort of solved it for her. And I think this is really important because in my experience, healing from any kind of long-term mental or physical health issue, there isn't a magic pill. We wish there was, but often it's really a combination of different things that help us. So I know so many people who deal with chronic mental and physical health issues have this maybe trauma around like, I've tried this, I tried that, this didn't work, that didn't work. I thought that was working for a bit and then it stopped working. There's this sort of devastation of feeling like there's going to be nothing to work that helps me. And I find that when there's a belief around that there should be a single thing that helps me, that can make it much harder. It can put a lot more pressure on each of those individual things that you're trying. But so much of the time, it's actually about looking back and saying, well, I'm taking this piece that worked from that and I learned this from that. And like, I'm not at a place of perfection at this point, which, if you can come to a place of like not needing perfection necessarily, but maybe it's being able to function, being able to feel joy, it's lots of different things that we can experience in that sense, then we can look at the constellation of all of the different things that we're trying as useful in our healing in the longer term. So please do check out What My Bones Know by Stephanie Foo. Honestly, whether you're a therapist or someone with trauma or not, whoever you are, it's a really beautifully written book. I highly recommend it to anyone. And if you are trying to understand some of these things about trauma a little bit more, this is a great entry into it that's not sort of a dry clinical perspective on trauma. It's genuinely quite funny at certain moments. I just like blasted through it. I read it so fast. It was so good. So highly recommend that. Check it out if you can. And you can get in touch with me if you have thoughts about this book, if you have comments, if you disagree with me, if you agree with me, if you have things to add, whatever it is, I'd love to hear from you. I'm on Instagram at Julie Peters Wellness. I'm on TikTok at Popcorn Therapy. Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. And if you are interested in getting some counseling from me, you can go to my website, juliepeters.ca. I see people in person in Edmonton. I also see people online from anywhere. I can do it internationally, and you can do a discovery call to see if we would be a good fit. So be in touch, and I'll catch you up next time.
Soundstripe.